Good afternoon. I think that's the first time I've had the NASA administrator as an opening act for a panel, so setting the bar high here. Good afternoon. I think most people are aware and would agree that the International Space Station has been one of the great achievements so far in the space age. And a lot of people focus on the technological and operational aspects of keeping a station permanently occupied now for more than 25 years. But there's also important political and diplomatic aspects of it. The ISS partnership has lasted for decades and has brought together a wide range of nations that have been able to work together despite changing geopolitical climates. Some people have even suggested that the ISS partnership should be considered for the Nobel Peace Prize. However, the ISS is not going to last forever. As soon as 2030, the station be retired, be replaced by commercial space stations. We're also seeing a push to return to the moon, as the administrator just talked about moments ago. So we're seeing that partnership is going to evolve in some way. And how can we retain the best aspects of that partnership, that diplomacy, in a new environment where there are more countries involved, more players, different ways of working together? And so we've got a great panel here to talk about that. And Peggy, I'll start with you. You've spent 695 days in space, both as a NASA astronaut and as a private astronaut on Axiom missions. You have firsthand experience with that ISS partnership. Give us a little appreciation of the value of that partnership, that ability to work together on the space station.
Well, it's an incredibly, as you said, a very important aspect of what we've gained out of that 25 years so far and counting of relationships on board in space. I've always said I think that international partnership will be the legacy of the ISS, but we are continuing that now. And that's actually what's really exciting for me working at Axiom Space is as we transition to commercial space, how are we going to continue that international diplomacy and relationship? And I think we're doing a great job. We've flown people from 11 countries in 4 missions in 4 years. We've conducted research for over 160 investigations, and even on just Axiom 4, we had 31 countries represented in those scientific endeavors on that one 20-day mission. So it's incredible what I think we can accomplish and transition to in the future.
So for the Director General, UAE is not part of the official ISS partnership, but the UAE has been involved in space station operations. Emiratis have flown to the space station. Sort of what is your perspective of the value of the ISS partnership looking sort of from the outside?
Well, good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here. And of course, I don't have 695 days of experience, so we value that. But we've had 2 missions to the International Space Station, and one of them was a short duration mission for about a week. And the next one was what we would call a mega mission for us, which was a full increment of 6 months, including an EVA. And we saw value in both of these missions exponentially, I think. And the way I'll describe that is, with our short duration mission, that was sort of our Yuri Gagarin moment, where it's our first mission to space. We saw the value of the ISS and how all of the partners are working together, how the operations work, how the science works, and we sort of got a taste of that. And then we worked for 5 years to really grow our astronaut corps. So we have 4 that we selected, train them effectively over a 5-year period, and then send them on a meaningful mission, which we did with Sultan and Niadi for a 6-month duration mission. And that mission really we focused on what we can do in terms of science, the operations, how we can be an active player in the ISS without actually being a signatory of the IGA. And I think that was a model of what you can do even though you have not built and created the station. So we saw the value there, and I think from there it really went bigger towards that the UAE wants to be part of these international collaborations, and we shifted towards active deep participation in Artemis. And that's obviously what we're doing at this stage. So I think the value of ISS for us was really to showcase that if we do things together internationally, we can do a lot more together.
So looking ahead to that post-ISS future, what aspects, lessons learned from that ISS partnership do you want to retain in an era where we'll have potentially multiple commercial space stations in operation?
Well, I think obviously having those international relationships and fostering them and expanding on them is going to be really important. So we take those lessons learned from the ISS and expand on them. Much as we've done in the Axiom missions so far, I really see it as something that we have huge potential to grow on. Obviously, you know, we've learned a lot over the years, not just in diplomacy, but in operations, and what it takes to build that international partnership is a lot of times the actual operations. You have to build that trust and that professionalism and the working together part that makes those international relationships stand up the test of time.
And so what, you know, you've had experience now both on the long duration missions as a NASA astronaut on the ISS and then on Axiom Space, the commercial missions. What were some of the differences in terms of putting together, for example, in the Axiom missions, putting together, you know, that international crew and, you know, getting the most out of a relatively limited time on the station?
Well, I found it really interesting and exciting, and during the NASA missions, I worked and trained in all over the world, in all the different countries that were collaborating as part of the International Space Station. So it involved a lot of travel, but it was still worth it because you got to see how different cultures worked, how they prioritized their training, how, you know, their operations differed, and it just gave a perspective that was really important, I think, for that international collaboration and the diplomacy that's required. I think it's the advantage of being in space is that you have more of what I would call the space culture. We're not as much different you know, each of us, of course, is representing our country, but we are a team. And we work together as a team to make each mission successful. The missions doesn't work if we're not all successful. So I think that attitude and that development has helped me going to Axiom to build teams that actually, you know, our sole purpose when we go in, it's going to be, we have an integrated mission. And everybody's country priorities are going to be met, but we have an integrated mission. And I think that mindset is really important for our future.
What is the UA thinking about in terms of using some of these commercial space stations that are being planned for operation in the coming years?
Yeah, I think, I mean, we've seen the plans that were announced yesterday and in the ignition event. And a big part of that is how, you know, what is happening after the International Space Station and the ISS. And the ISS has been truly, I think, as you mentioned, you know, it's a one-of-a-kind project. And we're always looking at what's next. And I think the model that we've seen is that commercial players can come in and maybe develop their own space stations and have them orbiting on their own, something similar to what we see with VAST. Or there could be a model where you sort of transition from the ISS itself and have modules linked to that. I think either way for us, the focus that we're looking at is this a destination that we can go to and conduct our science? I think what Peggy mentioned about working internationally with teams, that also has a key element for us, because when you're working in operations with people on the ground, that's where, first of all, you really learn, you build your capabilities, and you build trust. So I think that is also a very valuable part of having a space station. So when there's many entities or many countries involved in a space station, you get that by default. So these are things that we're looking at. But what I see happening is there might be sort of this public-private partnership and sort of transitioning to that where you'll have government astronauts alongside private astronauts working for the benefit of humanity. I think that is a model where it's sustainable and not all of the, let's say, burden of operations and cost is on the government or the private sector.
So are there specific things that you would like to do on a commercial space station in terms of research, in terms of inspiration for the next generation, technology development, or do you have sort of like specific priorities and how they would fit into some of these commercial stations?
Yeah, I think when we look at, you know, what are our objectives when we are going to space, One element is, of course, that we have astronauts that we've selected. We want them to be trained, and we want them to get operational experience in space. They, of course, become leaders in their own right. I think when we look at some examples from our astronauts, one of them was assigned as a minister. So at the end of the day, you create inspirational leaders for youth of the country. So that's one element. But the other element is linking up with all of our universities, our research centers, our science base of what potential technologies we can develop for microgravity research, what can we do as research using existing systems, and that is something that we built up over the past 10 years. Today we have several centers in our universities dedicated to microgravity research, and we try to link it with our missions, and of course mission agnostic as well. So there's the science element of it. Inspiration is key, and I think what I would say, if we have 5 pillars, one of them is inspiring the next generation, kids, youth, and we spend a lot of time, effort, and money on seeing how we can keep the youth and, let's say, the new generation engaged into what we're doing. Inspiring them, I think, is a key objective, and the best way to do it is through human spaceflight and those elements. And I think the 4th element is actual technologies that we're developing to improve life or to sustain life in space, help us here on Earth. And that's one element of why we looked at something like developing the airlock for the Gateway space station around the moon, because at the end of the day, when you're involved in these very high-tech, complex systems, and you're developing technologies that maybe haven't been developed or used before, that really does, first of all, upskill our engineering capabilities, but also it can spin off to something beneficial for Earth. So these are kind of the goals that we look at when we're looking at human spaceflight. I think that definitely transitions to commercial space stations, and if they should be able to meet those objectives of as a bare minimum of what you would want when you go to a government or commercial space station to do your activities.
So Peggy, how does that compare to what you're hearing from other countries in terms of what they would like to do on a station, and how is that in turn shaping what Axiom Station will be able to do?
Yeah, I think a lot of the countries, especially the smaller ones that don't have much space infrastructure in their countries, are really hoping to use the missions to stimulate a space economy in their countries. And by having that spaceflight exposure, it helps to do that. I know in particular, Hungary and Poland were particularly interested in that. Obviously, India had a bigger infrastructure already in place, but it did stimulate and attract the attention of the population. Again, all of that is important for the overall country's belief and moving forward in the technological advancements, as well as that international relations perspective.
And then in terms of how these relationships would work, I know a lot of countries want to make sure that what they invest comes back into their country in some way, in terms of how do you work with the countries to ensure that they get what they feel is a good return on their investment?
Yeah, obviously having a good return on your investment is what commercial entities are about, and we have to have smart ways to ensure that we are doing that. We also have to have smart ways to ensure that we are providing access to space in new and different ways that will invite more people rather than fewer people into the inner circle of space flight. So I think as we progress and expand, I think the government and commercial entities will cooperate to get the job done for whatever a particular government might want or need from a particular mission. And I think that's, at Axiom, we've done a great job of that, trying to prioritize each country's objectives, at the same time making the whole mission a success.
Going beyond low Earth orbit, the future of the ISS partnership was originally planned to be the Gateway. The partnership would cooperate on developing the Gateway. The UAE decided to join the Gateway by developing the airlock. Maybe you can talk about why you chose to participate in the Gateway and make that particular contribution to it.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think when you look at the success of the International Space Station, and I think one of the projects of the century, and when you look at the impact of it, What the UAE was looking at is we are, of course, we have access to the ISS, but as a user. But when we see potentially what's next over the next 10 or 20 years, the future is going towards the moon, as we've heard from Jared Isaacman and as we've seen over the past decade. And really looking at, what's post-ISS, for us it was typically something like an international collaboration around a space station called Gateway. And so we worked with our partners on identifying a need for the station, as well as an area that we can develop our skill set and contribute, and of course get benefits through that collaboration. So really that was what we were looking at, and I think that is very valid today in terms of what we've heard from NASA yesterday. When we're obviously transitioning away from Gateway as a concept, but transitioning to very high cadence missions on the surface of the moon, multiple opportunities for many countries to come in and collaborate, invest, work together on surface operations, whether it's whatever it may be. I think that is the same concept, the same idea, that we're doing something together and collaborating with many people to go further. And I think even the kind of this transition to focusing on surface operations over the next 5 years does also give a lot of opportunities for smaller countries that potentially have lesser capabilities to actively participate. So we'll see even wider international collaboration on the new plan that was announced yesterday.
Do you see any specific opportunities that you might pursue on the lunar base that NASA is talking about doing, given some of your capabilities? For example, you've built small lunar rovers.
Yes, I mean, we've definitely been thinking about this for a while, and there are multiple opportunities that we're looking at. So when you look at kind of the phasing of what NASA has presented, there's phase one, more kind of short-term elements. We're looking at our rover suite, so Rashid rover 2, Rashid rover 3. They're already, in our mind, part of that concept of sending robotic rovers to the surface, doing specific science and exploration to benefit that overall understanding of what we'll do on the moon. So that's already something we are doing. Phase two, of course, now we're studying this, and I think one thing that the UAE does quite well is that we can pivot, we can study elements, we deeply look at it, and then we can move or pivot very quickly to what we see is in our national benefit. And so that's what we'll be doing over the next couple of months to see where we can actually contribute actively in this overall system, with, of course, the dream in the mind that we would like to have Emirati astronauts on the surface of the moon. That's something that I think, when we are able to do that, that is a dream for us and a dream for the region as well.
What level of interest has there been in the UAE about participate first in the Gateway and now in the lunar surface? Are the students excited? Is there public interest in getting involved in something that had previously been considered something only the big superpowers had done?
I think previously, obviously, when we're talking about over the last decade and what we've seen, these types of things maybe in the region we're looked at, this is something for superpowers, bigger countries. But I think we've shown the way in the kind of model that we've adapted in cooperating with NASA or other international partners, that there is a model and a pathway where we can really be active and achieve these objectives. The level of interest from the UAE is all the way from the top, the leadership, all the way to, I would say, newborns, because when we get newborns, when we have a space mission, the hospitals give them free spacesuits for kids. So we had a couple of hundred newborn astronauts, and then we have interest all the way up to the leadership, where when our astronauts are coming back from long space missions, His Highness the President of the UAE is the one that is welcoming them home. So I think interest across, we see it everywhere, and really it's been a huge impact on even the mentality. So one of our very influential ministers mentioned to us that when he was a kid, people were dreaming of being a policeman, maybe a soldier, maybe a footballer. Those were the ideas of, what kids were thinking they would want to be when they get older. Today, a lot of them are thinking they want to be astronauts. So I think, not all of them can be astronauts, but at least they'll go into engineering, science, technology, and mathematics, and we've seen an uptick in people, especially women, going into those fields in the UAE. At the Mohammed Space Center, about 50% of our engineering team is young Emirati women. So I think that shows you that with these objectives or with these missions, you can really inspire a lot of people to go into this field.
So Peggy, when you're talking to some of the other countries that are working, want to work with Axiom Station, are you hearing similar interest about seeing that as maybe a springboard towards the moon or elsewhere?
Not specifically the moon, but I think definitely all of them are looking at it as a springboard for access to space, for developing space economies, developing space technologies within their country. They're very interested in developing their countries to be active participants in space. And I think the lunar options are going to be opening up to them as well. And it'll be even more incentive for folks to want to cooperate and fly.
One of the big questions about this future exploration out to the moon and beyond is what sort of governance structures we're going to have. We had back in 2020 the Artemis Accords. The administrator mentioned that UAE was one of the first countries to sign along with the United States. What value did you see in joining the Artemis Accords as being as one of the original signatories?
Yeah, so I think the Artemis Accords, that's led by our space agency, and we have His Excellency the Minister who's in charge of that with Salem, the head of the space agency. But we see a lot of value there. I think first of all, it's telling everybody that this is the way we intend to explore the moon. We intend to do it collaboratively. We don't intend to do any harm, etc. And obviously, the reasons we're doing it are for scientific exploration purposes. And I think that was the springboard for us to kind of take those agreements and as a kind of concept of how we're going to explore the moon, and then use that signature to springboard to actually active participation in the Artemis program by signing agreements for the rovers or for the Gateway airlock. So for us, I think it really acted as a very strong bridge of, this is the way we will explore, and this is the result of that. And I think that's what we'll use going forward as well. When we see yesterday's announcement in Ignite, everything there is encompassed in the Artemis Accords. And then when you see 60 countries there, and I see the interest even today and yesterday from nations that maybe don't have active moon exploration programs, that they feel now by signing the Artemis Accords and being active in Artemis, they can actually have their hardware or people eventually on the surface of the moon. So I think it's been a very good springboard for us.
Peggy, what value do you see in sort of the Artemis Accord sort of having rules of the road for space operations in a future where there are more people, more satellites, more activity in space?
Well, I think it's great for everybody to integrate the rules and the plan and understand kind of the pathway of where we're going. As an operator myself, I'm much more interested in actually how we're going to put the pieces together. That's what I focus on, and how do we integrate operations? How do we integrate training? How do we integrate all the piece parts that are necessary for a successful mission? So, it's there. The pathway to get there is important. So, obviously, I think the Artemis Accords were very important.
Any concerns about any sort of conflicts with, say, China? China has its own ILRS similar to Artemis Accords, trying to develop their own rules of the road. Just sort of, what dangers you see of maybe not getting along in space?
Well, I hope that the perspective of space keeps people in tune with that this is humanity doing this, and we are doing it as humanity and together, even if there are different platforms that we work from. I see the future of commercial space having multiple platforms, multiple ways, and multiple objectives for different platforms. So I think it's possible to have two different platforms and to work in space cooperatively. I think it's more important that we work as one, as humanity.
What role do you see the UAE playing in sort of working within the region in terms of providing an example, working with other countries in the region on some of these space activities, whether it's in low Earth orbit, on the moon, or elsewhere?
Yeah, I think the UAE has sort of maybe created a new model of how you can start a space program. So we're relatively new. I think this year in February, we as a center celebrated 20 years of our establishment. And in those 20 years, we've sort of gone into 5 main areas. And I think that is a model of how you can do maybe big space programs, but in a different way. Maybe a different cost level and a different amount of people working on. And we're working very closely with regional partners, alongside also the UAE Space Agency, with countries in the region. So we work with countries like Bahrain, where we launched joint missions, but also we had a very good agreement with our Bahraini colleagues to have them on board our rover to the moon. So what we're saying is that, we don't all have to build rovers. We don't all have to build the same satellites and repeat those things. We can learn from them, they can learn from us, and we can go together to do things better. And I think we have that model now happening. We see also human spaceflight has come back very strong. So when we kicked off our program a decade ago, the idea was that we haven't seen Arabs in space for about 30 years. And we want people from the region to be back in space, but we want to go sustainably. So if we're going to build a program, we're going to focus on the people, training them, building them. And then since we've done that, we've seen a lot of interest in the region. We've seen, obviously, astronauts from Saudi Arabia back again. We're collaborating them, working with them. We see also countries in the Middle East really interested in human spaceflight, whereas maybe before it was thought of, as you mentioned, maybe that's not for us, or maybe that's a luxury. Why are we sending humans to space when we should be focusing on clean water or something like that? And I think now people are starting to see that, this is really beneficial to us, beneficial to our people, and there is a model for the region that we can sort of work with our partners here, or we can do it differently than others.
So Peggy, how's that square with what you're hearing with other countries in terms of wanting to work together, maybe partnering together to do something joint on Axiom Station, for example?
We're hearing a lot about that. A lot of folks are interested in providing scientific racks or even modules to add to Axiom Station. So there's just huge potential for future collaborations and co-development of different aspects of whatever mission we have going on.
All right, good. Let's maybe look ahead a little bit. Let's look towards 2040 or so. By that point, the ISS will have been retired. We will presumably have multiple commercial space stations, presence on the moon. Sort of maybe give your vision of what you expect to see in 2040 in space, and what sort of diplomatic structures will be in place to enable that.
Well, I hope we have gone further than just human presence. I hope we have taken the next step and we are living there, working there, providing products back to Earth, doing new scientific research on the lunar surface and testing new hardware there, maybe mining other things, to process. That development, I think, is really important for us in space. And I'm really excited about what those years might offer us.
And is there anything that you think needs to be in place in terms of policies or international relationships or anything like that to enable that kind of future?
Well, I definitely think we will exist on international relationships. It's the only way that we're going to do this effectively and sustainably is to have those international relationships. I'm probably not the best policy person to ask, but I think any policies that help that expansion in space, the innovation and the collaboration needed for allowing commercial entities to be partners with government entities is going to be really important for the future.
And from the UAE perspective?
Yeah, I think when we look at, it's not that long, 2040. So what I would like to see is, we're surviving and thriving on the surface of the moon and starting towards goals of how can we do something similar to Mars. Or at least by that time, we've seen the first human boots on the surface of Mars, and we're starting to transition from really what we saw as a vision of a human village or settlement on the surface of the moon and starting the first footsteps for that on planet Mars.
And what, in this post-ISS era without the ISS partnership, what do you think needs to exist to sort of enable that from a diplomatic standpoint?
Yeah, I think, do we need another kind of IGA? Possibly, but not necessarily. I think for some, in situations where you want sort of a commitment and you want multiple countries to develop something that's really interlinked, it could be a good model if we have something like that. Or there could be agreements, country-to-country agreements, as we did with the United States. So I think there are, both models work, but I think a combination of, you'd have some core sort of IGA-style agreements that would encompass main partners, and then other players that want to have activities but are not part of that agreement can kind of slot in, exactly as we did with the Lunar Gateway model. So I think kind of a hybrid approach to those two types.
So down here to the last 85 seconds and counting here. So again, you brought us the vision of what might look like in 2040. Sort of what are you most looking forward to in the coming years in space?
Personally, I look forward to, what we can offer the Earth. I feel like the scientific investigations that we've done, even as recently as in the last Axiom mission, has the potential to really help people on Earth with new cancer treatment therapies. And I'm really excited about what we can offer back to the people on Earth.
I'm excited about boots back on the moon. So when we see, the last time that happened, I wasn't alive. So I want to be alive for this one. So I'm excited to see that.
I think we all want to be alive for that, and hopefully we won't have to wait very long for that to happen. So thank you for your time and attention.